There's a couple major Nintendo Switch stories we have to talk about today, starting with a new problem that Nintendo may be facing when it comes to Nintendo Switch demand and overall hardware production in the year of 2022 and 2023, and a conversation around what it could mean for the future of the platform. Then the big talking point for today's video has to do with the heavily rumored and long awaited Metroid Prime 1 remake and or Zelda Twilight Princess in HD games potentially coming to Switch, as there is a big update around the story and we have to go over all the details today. What's up, Nation? If it's your first time on the channel, make sure you join Sunbro Nation by subscribing below, hit the like button on this video if you enjoy it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. As I mentioned, guys, we got a couple major stories to discuss today, and we have to kick it off with a conversation around a potential problem that Nintendo may be facing in the upcoming future when it comes to their sales forecast, Nintendo Switch production, and even potentially some demand in the hardware, as we are now clearly 5+ years into the Nintendo Switch being sold on the market, and we do know to expect an upcoming investors meeting here in May of 2022, and there's now some reports online suggesting that there may be forecasts for a steep decline in Nintendo Switch sales when it comes to this year's performance. And while the Switch is still clearly an extremely dominant console and don't think it has any problems when it comes to unit sales typically, it is still an interesting point to highlight, as we may see some of that change in the upcoming months and years. So to get on the same page with this story, I do want to quickly hop over to VGC and read through their detailed article breaking down exactly what has been claimed here. Nintendo reportedly expects Switch sales to decline this year. Part shortages are said to be continuing and hampering production. Nintendo reportedly expects Switch sales to decline in its current fiscal year due to ongoing shortages and disruptions to logistics networks. That's according to a report by Nikkei, which claims that the company expects to sell around 20 million Switch units in its current fiscal year, which represents a 10% decline from the previous year and a 30% decrease from fiscal year 2020. The number of Switches sold in fiscal 2021 is estimated at 23 million units, a 20% decline from the previous year when the console peaked at 28.83 million units. Earlier this year, Nintendo blamed some of that decline on the global semiconductor shortage, as well as the previous year's Animal Crossing sales phenomenon. According to Nikkei, the decline is despite strong demand globally for Switch, and Nintendo would reportedly like to increase production if supply issues could be resolved. In February, Nintendo Switch became the best-selling Nintendo home console of all time with 103 million units sold as of December 31st, 2021, which eclipsed Wii's 101 million units. Switch still has significant ground to cover if it's to become Nintendo's all-time best-selling games hardware. Nintendo DS is the company's best-selling hardware ever at 154 million units sold, ahead of Game Boy and Game Boy Color at 118 million units. Outside of Nintendo's own consoles, only PlayStation 4 at 116 million and PlayStation 2 at 155 million have outsold Nintendo Switch. So I think by all accounts it's safe to say that Nintendo Switch is still wildly popular and successful in the year of 2022, and it'll be interesting to see the sales trajectory of the current lineup of Switch hardware, because of course we have 3 different models that account to the numbers sold, being the Switch Lite, the base model Switch, and now the Nintendo Switch OLED. And I do think that this ongoing chip shortage is definitely a factor in the decline, and it absolutely is affecting everything in terms of game production and hardware production around the world. And there are clearly still plenty of stores you can go walk into and see no physical hardware when it comes to Nintendo Switch OLED models, when it comes to things like the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. And so clearly there is a discrepancy in supply versus demand. However, it will be interesting to see the continued momentum of the Switch sales outside of the chip shortage, and once things kind of start to get caught up, because we do have to talk about this thing being on the market for over 5 years. And is it time for Nintendo to actually introduce something maybe by next year, like a revision or the Switch to a true next gen? Regardless, I don't think they need to do a clean break at this point. I think if they do something more powerful but in the same current family of systems, I think that absolutely secures Nintendo Switch as the #1 best-selling game console in history, period. It may even get there without anything like a revision, as clearly consoles continue to sell after they are the main market console. Like if they do come out with whatever the true next gen Switch is and it's a hard break from this current generation, the Switch is still going to sell at discounted prices prices for a number of years before its sales are totally done. So it may get there without a revision. I think a revision in the same family of consoles absolutely secures it as the best-selling console ever, and I think that's going to be a really cool achievement to look back at once Nintendo hopefully does cross that milestone. But I want to hear from you guys in the comments down below what you think about this potential sales decline in the year of 2022 and into 2023, as that is Nintendo's fiscal year. And do you think that it really does just come down to supply issues entirely, or do you think we are starting to see somewhat less of a demand for a console, as clearly we are later into its life cycle at this point in time? So I want to hear from you guys and all your thoughts and theories around this in the comments down below, and definitely share with me when you think we're getting any kind of revision or more powerful hardware for the Nintendo Switch going forward. Now, the other story we're talking about today has to do with probably some of my most hyped Nintendo game releases of all time, potentially making it to the Nintendo Switch in the year of 2022. We are talking about the heavily rumored and long-awaited Metroid Prime 1 remake and or Zelda Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD making it to the Nintendo Switch this year. Of course, there's been a lot of rumor mill talk and speculation over the last year plus around these games from a number of different credible industry insiders and people who have had track records with leaking Nintendo projects before they're officially announced, essentially stating that these games are more or less done and just waiting to be released. We will first start off with the Metroid Prime portion of this, as it was originally believed that this project would have been Metroid Prime Trilogy HD. Of course, Metroid Prime Trilogy was released on the Wii with all three Metroid Prime games and supporting motion for the entire Metroid Prime trilogy as well, and it was originally theorized that that is the version we would get ported to the Nintendo Switch with just HD visuals upgraded, because it would make sense to be able to play all three Metroid Prime games before the long-awaited Metroid Prime 4 is finally finished, as that game essentially went through a restart in 2019 and we are still waiting to see any glimpse of footage for it today. And it was later corrected that no, this is not the Metroid Prime Trilogy HD project. It is actually a standalone Metroid Prime 1 remaster or remake. It's essentially going to have more than just HD visuals touched up, probably gameplay refinements and mechanic refinements as well. And names like Emily Rogers, Nate the Hate, and even Jeff Grubb were all on board with that actually being the direction. Now, I believe it was Nate the Hate that said that the potential reason for it only being Metroid Prime 1 remake is that Retro was originally assigned to do a Prime Trilogy HD remaster, and then of course when Metroid Prime 4's development got restarted, that then turned into Retro taking over Metroid Prime 4, at which point they would have to kind of shift resources to that bigger project as opposed to remastering the entire trilogy. And maybe that was at that point the decision to just do a more in-depth Prime 1 remake on a different team and not tackle the entire trilogy. Whether or not we get Prime 2 and Prime 3 HD will remain to be seen at some point in the future, and I am hopeful that eventually those games make it over. But regardless, it sounds like for now the expectation should be around Metroid Prime 1 getting its re-release on the Nintendo Switch in 2022. Now, when you then talk about Zelda Wind Waker and or Twilight Princess HD making it over to the Switch, there was a lot of Zelda fans, including myself, that thought that the logical way to launch these games would be as part of Zelda's 35th anniversary celebration. One, because we saw Mario get a blowout collection of his classic games as part of his 35th anniversary, and Zelda, while it did see the release of Skyward Sword in its 35th year, it was not really marketed as part of the 35th anniversary, and it really felt like the Game & Watch device that we got at that E3 presentation was more or less an afterthought from Nintendo, saying, wow, a lot of fans were expecting us to acknowledge Zelda's 35th in a big way, so here's this commemorative device, but nothing major in the way of a game releasing or some type of combo pack of classic 3D Zelda games. Like, no, we didn't get that like what Mario got with his Direct. And our same group of notable industry insiders are claiming that, hey, they've finished these games, they are ported and ready to go on Nintendo Switch. It is just a matter of when Nintendo wants to slot them in for an official release. And the exact scenario discussed by Jeff Grubb last year was that if Nintendo needed more time for Zelda Breath of the Wild 2's development, they will absolutely choose to release those games then as essentially that stopgap or buffer game, as opposed to having them marketed as part of the 35th anniversary. And clearly it most likely would have cannibalized Skyward Sword HD sales as well if those games were to come out anytime around that particular title's release. That's a brief history of a lot of the expectations around these games and the leaks and rumors surrounding them. I now want to quickly get on the same page with the reason they are back in the news, as recently on one of his podcasts, Jeff Grubb was asked about these games from fans in the chat, and he had the following to say. They want to have a Zelda game every year and they have been holding on to this. Why wouldn't they just put it out this year? And if they don't put this out or some other Zelda thing this year instead of just waiting for Breath of the Wild 2, I will not understand. He then added, I think that this game, Wind Waker and Twilight Princess bundle, as much as it was a joke in the Megabit 64 video, I do believe it actually comes out in October. I suppose Zelda could come out in September maybe, but they already got some games in September, so October still sounds right to me. When asked about Metroid Prime 1 Remaster, he has this to say, I think we get Metroid Prime 1 Remaster in November, and then we get Advance Wars 1+2 in December. Now, while that sounds great, and I personally want to be extremely hyped for these titles to release this year for sure at this point, I do want to add some clarity and context to this conversation, as Jeff Grubb is not saying that he knows from somebody directly at Nintendo that that is when these games release and they're both definitely out this year. He is merely speculating off the fact that he does know these are real games and projects that are in development or done completely, most likely from the sounds of things, and he's just questioning when Nintendo will actually slot in these releases. So my personal thoughts on this is that I'm going to keep my hype levels somewhat low, although I will say that it is very promising that since we did get that Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 delay, and they like to release a Zelda game every single year, especially in the Switch era of things, I definitely think that it is a likely possibility that Wind Waker and or Twilight Princess HD are the games in question that can actually buffer that time frame for them to build up to the release of Breath of the Wild 2. And of course, us Metroid fans need something while we wait for Metroid Prime 4's development, and due to the sales success of Metroid Dread and where they want to take the series going forward, this is a logical step. So I'm very much in the camp that these are likely releases in 2022. Do not take it to the bank as fact, and if it doesn't happen, we can't say that we're going to be overly disappointed because Nintendo never said that these were direct projects to begin with, but there is a lot of smoke around this story. Sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire. I do think that is the case with these particular projects, as they just have across the board many different names that are credible, notable, and who have been around for a while claiming that these projects are indeed coming. So for me personally, I will have my eyes on the upcoming June Nintendo Direct for both of these announcements. Maybe it's something that one gets announced at the June Direct and one gets announced at the September Direct, depending on when these games are actually planned for release. But regardless, Nintendo's 2022 games lineup will be absolutely outstanding with the addition of these classic titles brought over to the Switch, and I think it just makes too much sense not to do it. So at this point in the video, guys, I want to hear from you all personally. What do you think about the new update from Mr. Grubb himself? Are you on board and thinking that 2022 is the year for these titles to make their way to the Nintendo Switch, or do you think this is one of those things that just doesn't have enough credence to it and you can't expect the games to make it to the Switch at all, and all of these insiders claiming that the games are real are really just not accurate at all? So I want to hear from you guys regardless of your personal thoughts and opinions on it, and definitely share with me if you had to predict when these games would launch. When do you think we do see them hit the Switch? So I look forward to hearing from you guys in the comments down below before you leave the video, as I do look forward to getting a back and forth conversation started with you all around this topic. Make sure you check out the weekend video if you haven't already, where we boot up Nintendo Switch Sports together and I share some of my early gameplay impressions and a recommendation on whether or not you may need to look into this game. Also, make sure you like, subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.